I did see a speaker talking about the next global world power. And he was saying it's not going to be China, it's not going to be Russia, it's not going to be the States. It's going to be the IT industry, because already the IT industry can affect what's going on.
So aside from the Tech Leaders podcast, some of you may be aware I am a director at bedigital. We are a software licensing specialist, amongst a couple of other things. But I was really keen to get somebody on from the world of software. It's a fascinating world. It's growing exponentially year on year. So Phil Hames meets that description. Phil has worked in the software industry since the late 80s and has witnessed the evolution of the industry from mainframes to cloud through to generative AI and everything in between. Following a successful career working for the likes of Xerox, Phil set up his own software business, took the plunge in 2004, working closely with software juggernaut Microsoft. We discuss software asset management and licensing, what that is and what is important for technology leadership teams. We discuss shadow IT, the history of software as a service and that model, and how Salesforce played a pivotal role in developing that model. Plus, we talked about the new Microsoft product, Copilot, which is a fascinating product and is going to be a real impactful step forward in how we interact with Microsoft products going forward, and much, much more. It was a joy to chat. It's Phil Hames. Phil Hames, thank you so much for coming on the Tech Leaders podcast. It's a pleasure to get you on, a software entrepreneur. We've collaborated on a couple of things, not you and I personally, but our company and yours, and very inspired by your journey and what you've built at the Business Software Centre. Let's start with this one, as we always do. What does good leadership mean to you, Phil?
Yeah, so I think good leadership is really setting some clear goals and targets, and then getting everybody to understand where we're aiming to move towards, and they know their part in achieving that, and they're able to measure their progress in achieving those goals. So it's really about goal setting and achieving the goals.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably my overview of it.
Yeah, clarity and basically setting what's important and getting on the boat to row there together, I suppose, isn't it? Okay, for the listeners who are not so familiar with yourself or Business Software Centre, could you please give us a bit of an introduction?
Yeah, so I'm the director of TBSC and also the founder. We've been going for about 20 years. I started off really in the IT business probably about 40 years ago. So at that time, software was coming in boxes and it was all on the floppy disks and distributed and sold as a packaged product. So there's been a lot of changes since then. I can remember the days before Windows even came in. So I've seen a lot of changes, and it's been an interesting career to have. So in terms of how I got into computer software, my first program that I created was way back when I was at university. I was working for a year in an electronics factory, and I did a program on a PDP-11 which sorted the costs of components for an electronic device. And we then re-engineered that technology, and I wrote the program for it and was able to do Pareto analysis off the back of that. So it was very simple. Probably the computer was as big as a wardrobe and had less power than your mobile phone. But we were able to do some good work with it and re-engineer the technology.
I'm keen to talk to you about Xerox. I understand you were there in the you joined there in the late 80s, worked for there for quite some time. Really legendary American company. I understand they invented the mouse, didn't they? And then Microsoft and Apple stole it. But there's lots and lots of innovation that have come out of Xerox. What was your time like there? What profound lessons did you learn from your time at Xerox, which you used later in your career?
You're quite right that Xerox invented a lot of technologies. So they invented something called STAR, and this was in their Palo Alto labs. And it had Windows, mouse, icons as an environment. I think Steve Jobs was working there and saw it and said, "This is incredible."
Oh, really?
And Xerox didn't know what to do with it. They said, "Yeah, but how's it going to help us to sell more photocopiers?" Whereas I think Steve Jobs saw it and saw the potential of it and then rewrote it all. And of course, then Windows came out as well. So it was a forerunner. So they were very inventive. They invented lots and lots of things at Xerox. So I joined Xerox. You're probably aware that their background was photocopiers. And I joined Xerox as the product manager for their software. So they'd acquired some software, like Ventura Publisher was probably the most well-known. And they did quite well with PC-based software. And my role was really supporting the channels area, launching the products for the UK market, working with distributors. That was my centre of competence. I then moved into other areas. For instance, when the Berlin Wall came down, then Xerox was really very active in Eastern Europe and Russia. And that was my area, looking after Eastern Europe and Russia for printing systems, laser printing systems. So it gave me a great opportunity to travel across Eastern Europe and Russia, India, Africa, at a time when everything was changing. It was a time of changing from communism to capitalism in those countries. So very interesting. Probably the greatest lesson I learned from Xerox, the technology of xerography was invented by a chap called Chester Carlson. So he invented like the photocopier, and it was the basis for laser printing. But I thought the guy who was the really clever guy was the one who thought to put a little meter on the photocopiers. So it meant they didn't charge people for buying a photocopier or a laser printer. They charged them for the amount of prints I did. So it was really the value of recurring revenue streams. And they set minimums, so you had to have a minimum. So it was the recurring revenue streams. And that's really what I found very interesting for software, because software, as you know, changed from outright sale to subscription selling with SaaS. So that was the sort of great lesson that Xerox taught me.
I wanted to ask you about the history of SaaS. This is the real embryonic period for software as a service, isn't it? And I think SaaS represented a shift from the traditional software deployment methods. But I'm just keen to understand, Phil, how did businesses initially react to this new way of sort of accessing and purchase and using software? What were some of the early challenges around widespread adoption of software as a service?
Yeah, so my job before setting up the Business Software Centre, or TBSC, was working for Intuit, and our primary product was QuickBooks for small businesses. And at that time, I worked with Barclays Bank and some other banks. And what we started to do was make available QuickBooks for small businesses on a rental basis. So it was on a subscription business. And obviously at that time, it was all loaded onto their own devices. And then they could use it as their small business accounting system. And the problem was always, how do you manage to sort of control or even turn off the software if people stop paying for it? Now, with the advent of cloud and the hosting of it, then it became a lot easier to control the subscriptions. And one of the big problems at the beginning was people trusting having their data in somebody else's environment. And that was the big thing to overcome. And I think that's probably still one of the issues that SaaS organizations have to face with some organizations, particularly with the security issues that are now happening, because it's still the customer's data.
Yeah, sure.
And the customer has to realize that it's their data. So if they've got it in Azure, Microsoft is not responsible for their data. They're just hosting it. The customer is still responsible for the security of the data. And I think that's always going to be one of the big issues.
I completely agree. And I'd like to come back to that, Phil, because I think the security piece is an important piece, especially in light of the products you develop. But I think just going back to the sort of evolution of the SaaS industry and that sort of how SaaS has basically evolved across mobile platforms and everything. But what were the sort of key milestones, do you think, in what products really pushed SaaS from a periphery fringe model? What products pushed it into the mainstream?
I think it was really Salesforce. The story goes that there was Larry Ellison, Oracle, with some of a couple of his senior managers, and they were talking about how things were going to go in the future. and I can't remember the names of the guys. I do have it somewhere, but the two guys were saying about the future and for software as a service and moving towards hosting the software rather than it being on the customer's own devices. And the guy who set up Salesforce was one of those guys. And he started then with it and set up the business, and, the rest is history. Of course, Microsoft saw what was happening and then decided they had to be in on the cloud aspect and then move towards SaaS. But I think other organizations pioneered it. And I can remember when I was at Intuit and we first did this rental of our software, the senior management said, no, we've tried all of this rental software. It'll never work. And then after the success that we had with Barclays Bank, then they said, yeah, this is really important. This is a great success. So they then looked at a SaaS version. And I think all organizations started to do this. Everybody suddenly realized SaaS was the model where you should go. And of course, having the platforms like Azure has made it a lot easier because, like for us, we can just develop the technology a lot faster and then put it onto Azure, and it's very quick to deploy. We deploy upgrades every 2 weeks, and we can add in facilities. So those old days of trying to upgrade everybody and keep them on the same version, they're gone. You just have one platform to look after. And so the advantages are there. There are some disadvantages, but the advantages for all software companies were there. And the greatest thing for the commercial model is the recurring revenue streams.
Sure, absolutely. What do you think the next evolution is for SaaS then, Phil? Do you see it evolving into something else over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, looking at software asset management, when I first was in TBSC, what we first were doing was looking at aspects like software asset management. And the big element then was compliance. And throughout the software industry, it was always compliance. Yeah. Has somebody got a valid license to be using this? Have they bought 10 licenses, but they're using it on 100 devices? That's largely gone out of the window now because if you've not got a subscription, you can't use it. The problem for most customers now is the other way round. It's not compliance having enough licenses, it's having too many licenses. Or having a license, let's say that's a pro license, but you're only using the standard facilities. So one of the things for the future is really for customers to understand if they're getting value for money from their investments. And I think that's something that needs to be tracked on a regular basis. It's not just, you can't do it just once when, say, there's an annual renewal. You need to be able to sort of do that on an ongoing basis. The other element, of course, for SaaS, as I've already mentioned, is security. We concentrate on Microsoft 365, and we can see really a dramatic rise, particularly September and this month, October, and just going back into the summer, a dramatic rise in the amount of malware and security alerts that are coming into people's tenancies. So this is growing, and there's a reason for it to grow because it's highly profitable for the organizations that are doing this. In many organizations, they've got highly skilled people. They are set up as like a proper business, and they're very professional in what they're doing. I looked at one, and there'd been some tracking of this organization, and through the sort of cryptocurrencies, they'd collected $54 million in the past year. So these organizations are bringing in a lot of money from their ransomware and their threats. So I think for SaaS, that's going to be the big issue for the coming years, controlling it. And certainly we've seen a lot of growth in security alerts over the past few months. And that's probably something that customers have sort of said, well, we've not been attacked yet. We've not been compromised yet. It's too late when it happens.
No, that's really interesting. So what kind of trends are you seeing in relation to cybersecurity threats, Phil?
Yeah, organizations have been sold security, I think, on technicalities, but there's a lot of common sense things that haven't been done. So one thing that we see is they've got third-party security technologies that are applied to external threats. And then these are applied, and in effect, they're sort of going through spam filters and things like that. But what we see is there are certain IP addresses, certain email addresses, and things that for various reasons are excluded from these external filtering. And so it just takes one of those for something to get into their Microsoft 365 tenancy. And then once it's in there, because these third-party technologies apply to external threats, they're not being applied to internal threats. So once it gets onto one device, then it can spread throughout an organization because they've not locked down the internal security. And there's things like, identity impersonation can happen, and then a senior person in the organization can then send out an infected file, and it then spreads across the whole organization. And that's when it's going to cause an issue. And these can be Trojans, they can be different types of malware, it can be ransomware. So these infections are in there. And then the next thing that people think is a safeguard is they say, oh, well, we've got a backup solution. So if we do get compromised or we lose data, we can restore all of that data. However, if they've not cleaned that data, then they're just going to reinfect themselves with this infected data. So I think they failed to look at the holistic aspect of it. Are there any gaps where people can get through?
Yeah.
Can it spread across your organization? And if you have got backup, are you cleaning your data and checking that on a regular basis, which is something that we try to help organizations to do with our health checks and our services.
Yeah, sure. Well, what about shadow IT, Phil? You're hearing this term more and more. The rise of sort of employees on laptops have their own SaaS products that they have access to. I do it myself outside of the company ecosystem. I access Evernote. I know that's just one example, but I think there are lots of other examples of it as well. What other hidden threats are out there for companies right now that may not be obvious?
Yeah, so you're quite right. I mean, I have talked to organizations and they'll say, yeah, we probably know 50% of what's actually being used. These are the IT people. So, yeah, there are a lot of potential threats. There are ways that when we do the security analysis, we can check what additional software is being used by users. And we can either close them down or allow them and things like that. But I think there are the tools there to do it, but the analysis isn't being done by most organizations. So the tools are already in place. And it's then a matter of understanding who's connecting into what environments. So you can do this, and there is with it, certainly, I mean, we work on Microsoft technology, so that's how we know it. But you can turn on facilities within the Microsoft stack, and it'll show all of the SaaS applications. I think there's something well over 25,000 that are in the service that can easily be identified. And you can see who is using which SaaS services and identify them. So this is for really cloud app security. So you can do that. But I think that the technology is not being used. Certainly most of the organizations we talk to, they're not being used. There's another issue that is really commonplace, which touches on this, is that many organizations have people come in and go in, maybe contractors, and they sign up for various services, and then they leave, but they've still got access to those services. We did have one case where a salesman left a wealth management company and he still had access, and he was able to go back into their services and pull data out about customers and then use it as a way of prospecting, and obviously ended up with a difficult situation. And I do think that organizations have to be really conscious about this, because if their data is taken, it's not the thief that is really responsible for it. It's the customer that's allowed, the owner of the data has allowed it to be taken, So under the GDPR rules, it's a bit like having your house robbed, and it's the person whose house has been robbed who's responsible for this. So I think this is again something that people don't realize. There is a lot of people leaving organizations and they still have access to their SaaS applications.
It's a difficult one. It's difficult for businesses to turn the tap off on everything when an employee leaves, doesn't it? You know what I mean? So I think that's part of the problem. But it comes back to having effective asset management, I suppose, doesn't it, across and having provisions in place for all of these type of things. Just getting back onto your chronological career journey, okay? And I want to go back to late 2003, early 2004, pretty important time in your life. You obviously see an opportunity and you leave a very stable job at Intuit and go to set up your own company. Talk us about that time in your life, Phil. How did that come about and how did you get going and what was your initial business plan?
Yeah, so the time at Intuit, I'd been there for over 3 years. The sales had, I think, quadrupled while I was there, and I was the sales director, so I'd had a good time there. The market was changing dramatically. It was changing very much from a sort of retail environment. At that time, PC World sold most of the software, but it was changing. It was a different market. And what I was seeing was a demand for additional small business software. And I started working with an organization from the States called Atlas Business Solutions, who did things like staff management products, some HR products, some business planning products. And they were complementary to QuickBooks and to other products like Sage. So I started to anglicize those and distribute those in the UK. So I sold them through places like PC World and Amazon, and then added in more products as a sort of portfolio for small businesses. And one of the things that we did very early on was to take this software and allow it to be distributed to small businesses, but we injected a piece of code in it that meant that the customers could pay for it on a monthly basis or an annual basis, but if they stopped paying, then we could lock up the software. So at that time, we couldn't host the software like you do in SaaS, but we did provide a rental system.
Sure.
And that then became what we called RentSoft or RentSoft Meter, and then we could make that available to other organizations. So we made it available to other software companies, and they were able to distribute their software, and they could rent out their software without having it hosted in the cloud. And then gradually things started to move to a sort of cloud basis. We then had this technology that monitored the usage of software, and we were able to meter the usage of software and then report back to organizations if their users were actually using the on-premise software. So that's what we called RentSoft Meter. So it was a bit of an evolution, really. And then when cloud came along, we were able to put this into a SaaS app, and we worked with Microsoft, not to sort of cut the costs necessarily, but customers could do that. But Microsoft said, well, hey, why don't you use it to see if you can get people using the software more productively? And that's what we did. Microsoft gave us some help on that. And we then created Smarter SaaS, which really looks at what you're using, what you're not using.
So when did you create that, Phil?
We started about 4 years ago. So we took the old technology of RentSoft Meter, but created it into a cloud technology, and we got a government grant to do it. And it was just about ready to launch when COVID came in. It disrupted things a little bit, but we did that about 4 years ago. But, all of the ideas of the RentSoft and RentSoft Meter were sort of over the past, I would say, 15, 16 years. But making it cloud and looking at the Microsoft SaaS applications made it a lot quicker and easier for us to develop a sophisticated product. Of course, what's happened is security has become really important. It's not just reducing the cost of or wasted cost of SaaS. It's how can we optimize the security of it? So we've built all those features in.
So can you just give us an overview of Smarter SaaS in terms of like what it does for customers and also the security product as well and how they fit together?
Yeah, so if you think about any tenancy that you've got for Microsoft 365, let's say you've got 1,000 users, then the things that you're usually going to check is, are those users using the apps that you've got? Because if they're not using the apps that you're paying for, then their productivity is not what you expected. So, one of the common things that IT managers say is, I know half my IT isn't being used, I just don't know which half. So we tell them who's using what, down to how many calls people do on Teams, how many meetings they attend, how many emails they send, how many they receive. We don't see what they're doing in it. We just give them the quantitative data. We don't tell them. We don't know what's inside any of these things. So they can see if people are using it. And then the other thing we spot is that certain people have not used these any of their apps for, say, the last 3, 4, 5 months. And then we say, well, could any of these have left? So we can produce that list, and then they can check it against their HR records, and they can recycle the subscriptions. So that's cost management and also security management, because they're clearing out people who've still got access. And then the other element is how much data have they got in there? So we're able to say there's so much data, this is what each user's got, and then they're able to put in place backup facilities and look at the security of that data. And our security elements that we've built in are really looking at their defenses, so their security posture, and saying, well, you're at 50% and the benchmark is 75%. And these are the actions you've got to complete in order to get up there. And then the next is saying to them, well, we can see over the last 6 months you've had 350 security alerts, and 90% of those are still open. And by the way, some of them are these particular Trojans, and this is what they'll be doing. So we're able to pinpoint that and say, you're wasting money, you've got a lot of data in there, you're not very well protected, and by the way, you're already under attack, so you should start doing something about this. And by the way, your backup that you've got isn't really effective because you're backing up infected data. So we then just introduced some services to say, okay, these are the services we can do, or we can clean it up for you. So to help them to do it. So either ourselves or our partners will do the services. I don't think customers want to buy another piece of technology. They just want their problem solved.
I wanted to ask you about Copilot, Phil. Do you know much about Copilot? And I suppose maybe if we can build this into a broader question about how do you think AI is going to impact Microsoft products and how we access Microsoft products over the next couple of years as Copilot gets more omnipresent?
Yeah, I've been on some calls with some Microsoft partners, and I think at the moment there's a little bit of confusion, and they're waiting to sort of really see how this is going to develop. So it's a little bit unclear about some of the licensing rules and how they can make full use of it. In general terms, I think AI is really important. I mean, already I know from our marketing, we use like ChatGPT to create our marketing materials, and it just cuts down the amount of time that you need to be able to develop these materials. You know, what was taking half a day is probably 10 minutes now. So for the future, if we can combine automation and AI, then there's a lot that we can do a lot faster. And a lot of our work is really around some of the consultancy, and by doing automation and also building in some AI, then what we can do is enable our consultants to do the work where they're absolutely necessary, but all of the analysis we can automate, and we can put in there some learnings to make sure that a lot of the consultancy work that takes more time can be eradicated, because we're just doing that through AI and automation. And then all we've got to do is get the customer to approve the changes. So taking out this manual work, I think is going to be a great benefit to us. We should be able to make things a lot better for the customer.
Have you had any conversations about like responsible AI? Or I think very specific concern is, you know, if Microsoft 365 Copilot empowers employees to access information across the organization, how are organizations going to ring fence sensitive data? Have you looked at that at all and had any conversations about that?
I think we're already having conversations about this, because certain data within an organization, you can assign security levels to the data. So like, for instance, in SharePoint, one of the biggest problems that exists at the moment is SharePoint sprawl, where hundreds and even thousands of SharePoint sites have been set up, but they're now maybe not used. They've got data in there, but there's still access. from people who've maybe left an organization or from an external user. And really, it's about assigning the security levels to the data and then being able to have a way to manage that access on a regular basis. So to get the reports as to who's got access to what data and close it down on a regular basis. You know, it at the moment, the manual work that's involved in it tends to put people off. But we know organizations that have got many thousands of sites that are unused, and they've got millions of files in there, and they're not in some cases not even backed up. They don't archive them. So I think what you're saying is quite correct. If you give people more access tools, they're going to access things unless you've sort of assigned various security levels to that data.
Yeah, sure. What are you most excited about, Phil, in relation to AI innovation and AI technology? What do you think generative AI could impact most profoundly in a positive way?
Well, I think we've already seen it with marketing. There's a lot more that can be done on marketing. So that's great. Traditional organizations that, you know, have spent a lot of time and effort on traditional marketing. Now, even 1-2-man organizations can generate massive amounts of marketing over the internet by using some of these AI tools and, you know, reaching large numbers of people. So it's changing the way that marketing works and sales. The other aspect around sales is the difficulty for a lot of salespeople is just working through all of the issues for customers and then presenting back the information. So, you know, in sales where you go in, you're asking the open-ended questions. A lot of the times the customers don't have the answers. They don't have access to the data. What we try to do is really give our health checks to our partners and to the customers so that they've got the data to make a decision, the right decision on the type of product and service for them. So if you can do that for an organization and you can build in the AI that then gives the sort of the good advice and the choices for a customer, it makes the whole transaction system a lot better. And then on implementation of services, if you can put that knowledge and that learning into the implementation, it means you're going to give a better service, you're going to be able to make it more cost effective, and you're going to speed up the whole process of resolving issues for customers. So I think these are the key things. Again, on product design as well, about getting the data and analyzing it, then you can see ways to improve your products for customers.
I mean, there's so many things it could impact. What's your general outlook on AI in terms of the replacement of jobs and things like that, Phil? Are you concerned, or are you more optimistic about AI technology innovation? Have you got any thoughts on that? And what roles do you think are potentially at risk?
I think it's going to be a gradual change. I mean, we've seen, you know, since I've been in industry, the industry that I'm in, a massive amount of change. But at one time, if you went into any large organization, there was a typing pool and you had, you know, maybe quite a number of typists who were just typing letters, sending letters out and things like that. So that's gone. You don't have that in organizations now. You don't have a typing pool. You don't have people sending letters. You don't have post rooms in most organizations, maybe in some of the big ones. But these were part of every organization, and jobs have changed. So I can only say that this is going to happen over the future. Jobs are going to change. You know, you might have differences. So some sales jobs might not exist. Some marketing jobs may not exist. Some consultant jobs may not exist. But there'll be new jobs that are coming in that people start to do. But I don't see it as being anything radical beyond what's already happened, because a lot of people had skills that are no longer needed. When I first was working in that project I told you about, when I was in the electronics company, a big part of my job was filling in stock record cards and then going and counting stock record. Now, nobody fills in stock record cards. It's all computerized. You know, so this whole aspect has changed. But this is just going to be a continuation of it.
Yeah, I interviewed somebody from OpenAI, and his name's Roger Verhoeven. His LinkedIn profile, I think, says it all. His headline on his profile is, "You will not be replaced by AI. You will be replaced by somebody using AI," which I think sums it up. I always think of that. I always repeat that line because I think it's so true. I think, the people who are going to be utilizing artificial intelligence technology and tools have got such an enormous advantage over everyone else because not everyone is embracing it. They just sort of seeing it as a gimmick.
Yeah, look at some of the organizations that were big in their days. Kodak. What's happened to Kodak? When I was
the story about them is unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah, Kodak were enormous, and now they're no longer there.
Wasn't it Kodak who invented the digital camera technology and then didn't see it as having market potential? Or maybe it was a bit of protectionism around their film business. So they shelved it and then everyone else picked it up. And then they went out of business. Unbelievable irony.
Well, all of these things happen. Working for Xerox, at one time the photocopier was the big thing in an office. Now maybe you've got laser printers, but Xerox had to change their business model into printing systems. So yeah, these changes are all going to happen. What you are going to have is jobs will be replaced by people who are using AI to do those jobs.
So I wanted to ask you a couple of things then before we wrap up, Phil. I just wanted to ask you about your career. Looking back at your career now, if you were to be able to speak to your 21-year-old self, perhaps when you worked in Software Limited back in the late 80s, what advice would you give to that guy, knowing what you know now?
Yeah, I think if I look back on it, I would have said, try and get a job with Microsoft and just enjoy the ride. Just watch the whole thing change.
And buy shares.
Yeah, get the share options. And, if you'd have had like 30, 40 years in Microsoft, what a change. What it was like, that was history, the history in the making. One of the things that I found really interesting was when my job at Xerox was going to Russia and the Eastern European countries. People were saying, it was to do with Reagan and Gorbachev that the Berlin Wall came down. But what I noticed in those countries was virtually nobody had their personal computers. We all had our personal computers. We all had IT. Everything was like 15, 20 years more advanced. And I thought, probably Bill Gates did more to bring down the Berlin Wall than the politicians because the difference in technologies was incredible. And then, my job was introducing some of these technologies. So I think it's what happened. I'm not saying just Microsoft. There was lots of others, obviously, like Apple and Oracle and other organizations that have changed the world, but they have changed the world. And I think they're going to change the world for the future. So I would have said to myself, get into one of those companies and just enjoy the ride and see it all happening. One of the things for the future, which I think is going to happen, is I did see a speaker talking about the next global world power. And he was saying it's not going to be China, it's not going to be Russia, it's not going to be the United States. It's going to be the IT industry, because already the IT industry can affect what's going on. Already we're seeing IT organizations being blamed for certain things that are not happening in the Ukraine and Russia conflict. And IT organizations can have a dramatic effect because they're supposed to be state sponsorship of certain hacking organizations. And I think this is something that's going to be so important in the future, that the IT industry globally and certain organizations are going to wield enormous power.
Yeah. They'll be like nation states in their own right, won't they? I was looking at Apple's revenue. If you were to put it against global GDP, it'll be 7th or 8th in terms of in nation states in the world. Its revenue is as an equivalent to GDP, which is astonishing, isn't it? Apple's just become a behemoth, and I'm sure Microsoft's not going to be far behind it very soon, given the way that things are going there. What's your thoughts on Microsoft, someone who's been involved with Microsoft for such a long time? What do you think about their turn in fortune? Because, I mean, obviously they had an amazing start. Then it was just a success story right up until the end of the 90s. But then they did fall off a bit, didn't they, with the rise of the Googles and Amazons of this world. But they really made a comeback in the last sort of maybe 8 to 10 years. What do you think about that sort of renaissance? What products do you think led that sort of charge and that comeback?
If I think back maybe quite a few years, I saw the launch of Azure and cloud computing, and there was obviously AWS and others. I just saw this and I thought, is this really going to take off? But I think cloud computing has changed the industry, and Microsoft has obviously done well out of that. And, you know, they had the technologies that they could move over to cloud computing and move people onto cloud computing. And certainly, you know, everybody was using Office, and then they moved it into Microsoft 365 and things like COVID, where, you know, remote working has become really important. It's had a dramatic change certainly on Microsoft's fortunes. I'm sure you can remember, suddenly we couldn't travel in our work. We were locked down. So what did we do? Everybody was using Teams. Everybody was using Microsoft 365. And it's changed the working environment. You know, a lot of people. So these things are all driving change for IT companies, and they're capitalizing on it, particularly Microsoft.
I just wanted to wrap up then maybe on this one. What sort of person, book, anecdote, story? I always ask for a book recommendation, but let's make it a bit more broader than that. What piece of content can you recommend? Maybe that's inspired you in the last couple of years.
Yeah, so I think certainly for quite a number of years, I've always listened to some talks by a guy called Earl Nightingale. So he was a radio presenter in the 1940s and the 50s and even into the 60s. And he gave advice about how people could become more productive, how they could be focused on their goals. So most of his talks, they were recorded for radio and put onto, and they're available on YouTube. And one of his famous ones is called The Strangest Secret, and it's around how people can focus on where they want to be successful in life and how they can achieve it. And he uses lots of research that he's done. And I think, you know, there's lots of modern motivational speakers, but none of them are a patch on Earl Nightingale.
Yeah, I think he was one of the pioneers then of this type of self-help category in America in that period, I think, wasn't he?
Yeah, the other thing that I think sort of is, you know, really unusual about him, he was, you know, one of the sort of Hall of Fame of radio speakers and, you know, these motivational speakers. But it was really difficult for him because he actually had a throat problem, which meant his speech was difficult. He had to overcome certain problems to actually speak. And you can hear it in his voice. He's got a gruff sort of grating voice a little bit. But his broadcasts are like, you know, gold dust. So I think I would say he's probably a great inspiration. And certainly for young people starting out in their careers, just listen to his tapes because he gives fantastic advice and it's all clear and to the point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really good recommendation. We've not had that one before. I always ask that question, but Earl Nightingale is certainly a new one. So we will put a link to The Strangest Secret plus a link to Earl Nightingale in the show notes. Thank you so much for sharing that. What's next for Business Software Centre, Phil, and where can people find you?
Yeah, so we are www.tbsc.cloud. So quite an easy to remember. And we are info@tbsc.cloud. And if anyone wants to contact me, they can do it through that. In terms of what's important for us for the future, well, and for me and for the organization, is really to sort of capitalize on what we've done over, I would say, you know, the past 4 or 5 years with the new technologies. We continually improve the product and we add new features in on a regular basis, but we want to sort of make it wider available. So we're working with more and more partners and going into more international markets. So we have been, by necessity, sort of UK focused, but now we're sort of doing more in Europe and North America.
Brilliant. Okay, good stuff. Well, look, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on the Tech Leaders podcast.
Right. Thanks very much, Gareth.
If you found this episode valuable and thought-provoking, we would really appreciate it if you could quite simply click the subscribe button and possibly even leave a review. This helps us to spread the word and reach a wider audience so that we can make a bigger impact and bring you the best guests possible. Thank you so much for downloading.